should be live. Let me check make sure we're getting sound. Alright, we should be live. Okay, sounds like we are. So, sorry for the mistake earlier today. Setting up my computer again, I guess something got mixed up with the encoding software and it decided to mute my microphone. Anyway, so I am going to be going through the material for today again, and I'll be happy to take questions and the usual thing. After this is done, I'll jump into the review section unless it's way before 8 o'clock. I'm not sure exactly how long this will take. I think last time it took me about 20 minutes though, so should be pretty close. Okay, so the reading for today focuses on the second paradox of blackmail. So you'll recall that the first paradox of blackmail is the the question of why is it that when we take two legally permissible actions, like asking someone for money and threatening to do something that you have every right to do, why when we combine those do we get an illegal action called blackmail? So that's the first paradox, and that is a large part of what we discussed yesterday when we were talking about Feinberg. Today we're going to be talking about the second paradox, which we've discussed a little bit so far already. It came up in, I think, both Katz and Block. And the second paradox is that there's an asymmetry between the legal status of two transactions that substantively are identical, but are different in form. So, to return to our canonical blackmail case, we've got Deborah, who knows about Jack cheating on his wife, and Deborah goes to Jack and says, "Pay me $10,000 or else I'll tell your wife about how you were cheating on her." So that's a case where Deborah is blackmailing Jack, and it would be illegal. It would be illegal for her to make the offer and also for her to accept money. Now, on the other hand, Jack might learn that Deborah knows that he had cheated on his wife and goes up to her preemptively and offers her $10,000 to not tell his wife about this. In this case, the offer is not illegal. It's not illegal for Jack to make the offer nor for Deborah to hear it, and it's also not illegal for Deborah to take the money. Okay? But this is odd because the transactions, you'll notice, are exactly the same. In both cases, Jack is paying Deborah to be silent about this issue, to not tell his wife about him cheating on her. So it's odd that the law would distinguish between two transactions which are identical in all substance except for who initiated them, right? So on the one hand, we've got what we call blackmail, which is when Deborah initiates it, and on the other hand, we've got something else. It's called, by Christopher, a blackmail-y initiated transaction, or exchange. And it's unclear why it would be that these two substantively equivalent transactions would have such different legal status. One is illegal, one is legal. Right? So, this is the second paradox of blackmail. And there are lots of different attempts to resolve it. There are also three different pathways that you can go with it, you might notice. So the pathway that most people want to go, and the way that justifies the current state of the law as it is described by Christopher as the liberal path. And this path tries to show that this paradox is not real, and in fact, there is a good explanation for why we treat them differently, and that blackmail should be illegal, while blackmail-initiated transactions should not be illegal. On the other hand, you have the libertarian path, and the libertarian path says that we resolve this paradox by treating them equally, and in particular, we treat them equally by allowing both of them. Both of them should be legal, both blackmail and blackmail-initiated transactions. Our third option is what Christopher calls the Marxist path. And this says we're going to resolve the paradox by treating them equally, and the way that we're going to treat them equally is both of them are forbidden. Blackmail is forbidden, and blackmail-initiated transactions are forbidden, because in both cases exploitation is going on, right? So these are the three different paths. Now, Christopher, in her paper, is not choosing one of these paths, so she is blocking off the Marxist path, but we'll see that later. Instead, her paper starts by looking at various different ways that people have tried to resolve this paradox, and she thinks they all fail. And then she's going to give some arguments for why she thinks that regardless of how we resolve the paradox, the way that we should not resolve the paradox is by criminalizing blackmail-initiated transactions. So whether we think blackmail should be legal or illegal, we should keep blackmail-initiated transactions legal, according to Christopher. Okay, so let's go into the various different arguments that she goes through. The first one is from Posner. We've heard a little bit about his view in general before. She's looking at a different element of his view, but Posner, you'll remember, is a consequentialist. So he thinks that the law is justified in virtue of the consequences that it has. And so in the case of blackmail, an argument against blackmail from a consequentialist point of view is that blackmail creates waste. It creates wasteful activity because it incentivizes people to go out and collect embarrassing facts about others that they would be willing to pay for people to be silent about. And it's expensive to do that, right? It's expensive in time, in resources, in energy. So it's a substantial investment that someone might have to engage in order to get something that would allow them to engage in blackmail. But in the end, there's no socially useful production that comes out of this investment. So we like investment when we're investing in building new factories or building a new store in town, right? That sort of investment is socially productive. That is, it makes everyone better off, or at least it makes many people better off for its having happened, for us to invest in that way. Blackmail, on the other hand, is not socially productive. It's socially neutral, the transaction itself, because it's just a redistribution of wealth from one person to another. No one gains anything above and beyond just the money that's transferred, right? So one person loses exactly as much as the other person gains. However, because there is this additional investment in resources, it is in fact socially wasteful for blackmail to occur, because we've lost social resources, our time and energy, and perhaps money or other sorts of resources that could have been put to productive uses is instead being put towards obtaining embarrassing facts. So that's a waste, that's a cost that we have to pay, but there's no resulting benefit. Because all that happens is is that resources get redistributed between the blackmailer and the blackmailee. No one gets a new thing that they didn't have that no one had before, right? So in that way, blackmail is wasteful, and so the law, according to Posner and a consequentialist sort of view, wants to discourage people from engaging in that wasteful investment. Blackmail-initiated exchanges, on the other hand, don't seem to have this result, according to Posner, because it won't encourage people to go out and obtain and spend resources obtaining secrets, because there's no way for them to profit off of that. because they can't go out and advertise that they have these secrets and thereby get other people to initiate exchanges with them. That's the argument that Posner gives according to Christopher. Now Christopher responds that she thinks this is wrong, and in particular because advertisement still is possible, even if blackmail is illegal. So it's permissible for you to announce that you have found out an embarrassing secret about someone, or for you to go and tell them that you have this embarrassing secret about them, and then to hope and to wait that they will come to you with an offer of payment. Thus you avoid criminal liability for engaging in blackmail, but at the same time you get paid just as you would had you initiated the transaction. So it seems to Christopher that this doesn't resolve the paradox, because in fact blackmail-y initiated exchange has the same sort of incentive effects as legal blackmail would. Okay, so moving on to the next argument. This is from DeLong, and this is about narratives, the narrative place of the blackmailer in the case of canonical blackmail and blackmail-y initiated exchanges. So DeLong's argument goes something like this, according to Christopher. In the canonical case of blackmail, the blackmailer is going out and exploiting a person who has this embarrassing secret that they have. And not only that, so they're not only harming this poor person with the embarrassing secret, who might be a bad person, but we sort of sympathize with them because this blackmailer is doing this thing to them. Not only are they harming that person in our narrative, but also they're harming all of society by keeping secret something that many people might want to know, that it might be very valuable for the public to know about someone. So the blackmailer in the canonical example seems like an evil guy. Now in the blackmail-y initiated exchange case, it's different, according to DeLong. There it looks like the blackmailer is an ally of the blackmailee. He's gone in and he's put his efforts together to keep secret this embarrassing thing about him, about the blackmailee. So in that case, we think that he seems like a much better person, the blackmailer. So Christopher suggests that there's a problem with this. Even if you want to buy the sort of narrative explanation of why we ought to treat these people differently, or why we do treat them differently in any case, it seems to Christopher that it's the transaction, rather than the person who initiates it, which transforms the blackmailer's position from one that's adversarial with the blackmailee to one which is cooperative, that's in alliance, right? Because it's the incentive of getting paid to keep this secret that transforms the blackmailer into someone who's willing to cooperate, right? So that's the transformative element, and that exists in both cases. So again, this doesn't resolve the second paradox, as Christopher points out. Okay, so the next argument is from Katz, and this is about form versus substance. And so Katz says, look, we agree that there's no substantive difference between a canonical case of blackmail and a blackmail-y initiated exchange, right? So those two cases substantively are the same. However, the form is very different, because who is initiating it affects the form of it, and oftentimes form can matter when it comes to the morality of an exchange or any sort of action. And so even if there's no difference in substance, this difference in form can explain the difference in treatment. Christopher doesn't exactly say that the problem is with Katz's argument in its structure, but rather that Katz doesn't really explain why it is that form matters here, or how it is that form matters here. And so the explanation isn't sufficient to explain to explain away the second paradox and tell us how it is that these should be relevantly different in the law. Okay, so moving on now to the argument from Berman, which is about harms and motives. So Berman says that in the case of blackmail, we can straightforwardly see the blackmailer as harming the blackmailee, and doing so with a bad motive, not with a good one. And it's perfectly ordinary for the law to punish people and prohibit people from harming others with a bad motive, right? But blackmailee-initiated exchange, on the other hand, says Berman, according to Christopher, there's no apparent harm because the blackmailee is the one offering the terms. And furthermore, there's no implication of bad motive on the part of the blackmailer, right, or the person who's keeping secret in exchange for money. Christopher replies to this that this doesn't quite square with her understanding of the facts of blackmail. So the blackmailer is, even in the canonical case, threatening only what they have a right to do, right? Remember the first paradox of blackmail. There's nothing wrong with what the blackmailer is threatening to do in itself, right? So it's not clear that harm is being done in that sense. They're not being harmed in the sense that they're being threatened into doing something which they have no right to do. Furthermore, the loss of money on the part of the blackmailee is the same in both cases. So if the harm is supposed to be explained by the loss of money, or whatever other consideration is given in exchange for silence, then it's not clear what the difference would be. Furthermore, the motive of the blackmailer seems to be the same in both cases. They want to obtain money from the blackmailee in exchange for their silence. That's their motive. So the motive and the potential for harm seems to be the same in both cases. So again, this doesn't seem to resolve the second paradox, according to Christopher. Okay. Moving on to the last of the liberal ways of resolving this paradox that Christopher considers, we have Smith and society's fear of the blackmailee. So Smith says, according to Christopher, that blackmail makes the blackmailee a danger to society, one that we rightly fear. And in particular because the blackmailee is likely to engage in some sort of self-help, Smith calls it. Self-help being murder, theft, embezzlement, all sorts of different possible crimes, in order to get the blackmailer off their back, either to pay them off or to get rid of them. And so, because blackmail causes this person to be a danger to society, to be something that society rightly fears, that's why it's rightly prohibited. But, according to Smith, via Christopher, a blackmailee-initiated exchange doesn't give rise to this danger and fear, because in that case, we can assume that the blackmailee has it under control, and so we don't have to think, oh, they're going to go out and try to resolve this by other means. But Christopher says, look, the blackmailee has the same motive, regardless of who initiates the transaction, the same motives, regardless of who initiates the transactions, and so is equally capable, in the case of the blackmailee-initiated exchange, to engage in the same sort of self-help. Moreover, a blackmailee who is confident and proactive enough to initiate such a transaction and not just wait for the demands of the blackmailer may well be the kind of person who we should fear even more. So not only does this not resolve the paradox, but in fact it seems to give evidence that we should flip our judgment of these cases and make it more likely that it should be criminalized, that blackmailee-initiated exchanges should be criminalized compared to blackmail in the canonical case. So again, Christopher thinks this doesn't resolve the paradox. Okay, so what about the libertarian ways of resolving this paradox? Well, Christopher looks at two, one from Walter Block, who we read earlier, and another from Murray Rothbard. So Walter Block argues extensively, of course, for legalizing blackmail. And the argument that he has, which Christopher focuses on, is that blackmail and blackmail-initiated exchanges are substantively the same, and therefore, since we are very confident that blackmail-initiated exchanges should be legal, we also should think that blackmail should be legal, since they're substantively the same. Christopher's objection to... Oh, right. So let me say a little bit more about what I mean by substantively substantively the same, at least as Christopher presents it. And the thought here is that in both cases, we have a transaction which is exchanging silence on a subject or keeping a secret about something in exchange for money or some other sort of consideration, right? So no matter who initiates, the economic facts are the same. But Christopher replies, if we think about this in analogy to robbery and robbery-initiated exchanges, we'll see that this sort of reasoning will lead you to think that robbery ought to be legalized, which of course libertarians don't think, and probably very nearly no one thinks. And the thought here is this. In the case of a robbery-initiated exchange, what's happening is someone is going up to a potential robber and offering them, say, $1,000 in exchange for that person agreeing to neither rob them nor threaten to rob them in the future, right? So they're trading away some amount of money in exchange for security, personal security. Now, in the case of a robbery, the robber goes up and says, give me $1,000 or else I will harm you in some way, right? So again, the exchange seems to be $1,000, or we could say any sort of money or consideration, in exchange for personal security, right? And so given that, they are substantively the same in the same way that blackmail and blackmail-initiated exchanges are substantively the same. The economic facts are the same, regardless of who initiates. And we have good reason to think, according to Christopher, that sorry, it's difficult to say that word, initiated exchanges ought to be legal, right? It ought to be legal for you to go up to someone and say, I offer you $1,000 to not perform some criminal act against me. At least it makes sense in some cases to allow that, according to Christopher. So if that's right, then by the reasoning that Christopher attributes to Bloch earlier, we ought to then legalize robbery. But this is problematic, of course. Now Bloch might reply, and Christopher anticipates this sort of reply, that there's a difference in the blackmail case, because everyone's offering things there in the blackmail case that they have a right to offer, right? The blackmailer has a right to be silent or to expose the secrets, right? But the robber, on the other hand, doesn't have any right to threaten the security, the personal security of the person who's being robbed, right? So we'll talk about this a little more after we talk about Rothbard, because that's where Christopher goes into it, into this line of libertarian argument. But in any case, we can suffice to say that Christopher isn't trying to say that all versions of libertarian arguments won't work, but rather just the particular one that she focused in on, which is this fact about the economically, substantively similar circumstances of blackmail and blackmail-initiated exchanges. Okay, so moving on to Rothbard. Rothbard has an argument from ambiguity in favor of legalizing blackmail. And here's the outline of it. It's often ambiguous who is initiating the exchange of secrecy for money, or secrecy for some other consideration. So it makes sense then that the law would treat all of them the same, because there's no way to draw a principled difference between them. So here's an example to make that a little clearer. Suppose that in the Deborah and Jack example that we've been using, instead of going right out and saying to Jack, pay me $10,000 or I'll expose your cheating to your wife, she goes up to him and says, I plan to expose your cheating to your wife. Do you think that's a good idea? Right? Or, she says, I've come into this evidence that you've been cheating on your wife. What do you think I should do with that? And of course the expectation here on Deborah's part is that Jack will offer her some sort of money or other consideration in exchange for her silence. So is it the case then that Jack initiates the transaction or that Deborah does in this case? And it seems pretty unclear who exactly should be considered the initiator there. There's reason to think that it's Deborah, there's reason to think that it's Jack. If we were to draw a bright line and say that it only ever matters who's the person to actually make the offer of an exchange, then it seems like blackmailers would very easily be able to get around any prohibition on blackmail simply by being careful about how they worded their threats and offers to be silent in exchange for money. Right? We wouldn't want that. So this ambiguity creates a problem for the law. Right? And according to Rothbard, the best way to resolve this is just to permit all of the different possibilities there. Right? Christopher says that the problem with this is a very similar problem to the problem that she had with Bloch's argument, which is that the same could be said of robbery, right? Robbers might well be able to make their threats in a way which doesn't explicitly say that they are demanding money or something else in exchange for not hurting the person. They can engage in the same sort of strategy of not explicitly making any sort of threat or offer, but instead waiting for their potential victim to make them an offer, and thereby get around this problem of robbery being illegal. So it could be ambiguous then there if a robbery is occurring or if a robbery initiated exchange is occurring. So, like I said, Rothbard and likewise with Bloch have a possible way around this, and Christopher admits this in a footnote. Says that they might want to distinguish between a coercive or unlawful proposal and non-coercive or lawful proposals. But she just says then the argument is a different one, right? It's different than the ambiguity argument that Rothbard is giving. So at least that argument doesn't work, according to Christopher. Okay. So what does Christopher want to say? Christopher wants to say we ought to keep blackmail initiated exchanges illegal no matter what we decide about blackmail. So if we go with the libertarians and say blackmail ought to be legal, what she says still applies. And if we want to say with the liberals that blackmail should remain illegal, what she says still applies, right? And she has two arguments. The first is her comparison to robbery-initiated exchanges, right? So it's legal, again, to repeat this, for you to offer someone money in exchange for them to not engage in a criminally prohibited act, right? Like robbing you. It's legal for you to offer them that. And if that's legal, it stands to reason that it ought to also be legal for you to offer someone money to not engage in something they're perfectly legally permitted to do, right? Certainly if there was going to be a disparity between these two, the disparity would be on the side of not allowing transactions which are paying someone to not do something which they already are criminally prohibited from doing, right? So that's the first argument. The second argument is about the disparate liability, the disparate criminal liability that would be faced by two people who don't really seem to be morally very different, right? So here's the case that Christopher is trying to get us to look at. Suppose that we start with the canonical case of blackmail, right? Deborah goes up to Jack and says, "Pay me $10,000 or else I'm going to tell your wife that you cheated on her," right? Easy, straightforward case of blackmail. Now let's do a different case. Jack finds out that Deborah knows about his cheating on his wife, goes to her and says, "I'll give you $500 in exchange for you not telling my wife about me cheating." And Deborah says, "No, I don't think that's enough. I want $10,000 or else I'll tell her." Now right away, Deborah has just engaged in blackmail. So she is at that point just as criminally liable as she would have been in the first case, right? But then suppose Jack says, $10,000 is kind of a lot of money. How about $5,000? Will you do it for $5,000? And Deborah thinks about it and says, "Yes, okay, $5,000 is enough. I'll keep your secret for $5,000. Now, if blackmail-y initiated exchanges are illegal, then when Deborah accepts that exchange, when she takes the $5,000, she is then liable again for another crime on top of the blackmail that she already was liable for in her previous statement, right? Blackmail doesn't require that the transaction go through, just that you offer it. So even though Deborah is getting less money from Jack in the second case, she would be she would have more criminal liability, right? She would have either 2 counts of blackmail or 1 count of blackmail and 1 count of whatever crime we're going to call the acceptance of money offered by a blackmailee, right? So that doesn't seem to make sense. There doesn't seem to be a strong moral reason to distinguish between those two cases. And that's an argument in favor of blackmail-initiated exchanges being legal, right? That's Christopher's main idea. Now I see that we have come past 8 o'clock, so it is time then for the review session. I'm not sure that anyone is watching right now, but I'll wait and see if there are any questions. I'll also check D2L while I'm at it. See if any were posted. There have been none posted on D2L. Let's see. Okay. Doesn't look like there are any right now. Feel free to send me an email, post on D2L any questions that you have. I will be posting the exam sometime tonight. It may be a couple hours from now, but I will be posting it sometime tonight. And let me remind myself when I have set the due date for. Let's see. Right. So you'll have until Tuesday to finish the exam. And at that point, the class will be completed. For those of you, just a reminder for those of you who are turning in the optional term paper, there is a Dropbox folder up on D2L. Go to the Assignments tab on the top and go into the Dropbox and submit there. Be sure to do that on time. It's going to be difficult for me to accept anything late there, simply because we don't have a lot of time left in the course and I've got a lot of grading to get done. Okay, so I guess that is it for this. Thanks for taking the class. I enjoyed it. I hope that you did too. And feel free, of course, to email me with any questions. And I'll have your grades to you as soon as I can. Thanks.